Zhuangzi, Part 1. Let's review the last class. If you remember from the lecture on the second part of the Tao Te Ching, the word de means something like moral force and represents the way in which the ruler should transform his subjects. The Tao Te Ching's political philosophy is in part a reaction against Confucian ideals. It wants to return to spontaneous virtue, not advocate a program to advance positive cultural values. The ruler should adopt non-action and not promote any improvement of the state or the people, but allow them to return to a state of nature. There are some interesting similarities and big differences with modern libertarianism, and the Tao Te Ching exercised important influence on military thought and legalism. Here's an overview of today's lecture. First, I will explain what the Zhuangzi is as a text and its relation to its supposed author, a person named Zhuangzi. I'll discuss the relationship of the Zhuangzi with the Tao Te Ching. I'll talk about the relation of the Zhuangzi to another early Chinese philosophical school called the Logicians. And I will explore the radical skepticism of the Zhuangzi's attitude toward language. And then, finally, I will connect the Zhuangzi's skepticism of language with its general attitude toward epistemology, which is the philosophical study of how we know things. So, what is the Zhuangzi? The Zhuangzi is the second book of early Taoism. The first 7 chapters, also called the inner chapters, are supposed to have been written by a person named Zhuangzi in the 4th century BC, the rest by his later followers. Though most Chinese people have not read the book, almost everyone has heard of it, and it has a roughly similar status to the Tao Te Ching inside China. In contrast, outside China, while many people have heard of the Tao Te Ching, almost no one has heard of the Zhuangzi. Within Chinese culture, although Lao Tzu is supposedly the founder of Taoism, the Zhuangzi is probably just as influential on the history of Chinese literature and philosophy. The book is especially known for a poetic, playful writing style and for bizarre allegories. In some ways, this has a parallel status in Chinese literature to that which Aesop's fables has in the West. So, who was this person, Zhuangzi, who supposedly wrote the book? The title of the book, Zhuangzi, is named after the master Zhuangzi, Master Zhuang, or Zhuangzhou. This person was supposedly a minor palace official who lived during the 4th century BC in the regional kingdom called Chu in the south of China. He is usually considered a continuer of Lao Tzu's Taoism, even though by even the most conservative version of their biographies, he could never have been Lao Tzu's student because he lived a couple centuries after Lao Tzu. In fact, it is doubtful that Zhuangzi would have called himself a Taoist. The notion of a school of Taoism was a later categorization. So, it is important to think about commonalities of the Zhuangzi with the Tao Te Ching, but also important to think about differences. There are some phrases which the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi have in common. Traditionally, people have interpreted those commonalities to suggest that Zhuangzhou was influenced by the Tao Te Ching. Moreover, the Tao Te Ching seems to have circulated first in this state of Chu, where Zhuangzi was supposed to have lived. However, the clearest references to the text come from materials interpolated into the Zhuangzi centuries after Zhuangzi was supposed to have lived. It's even possible that the Tao Te Ching was not written until after Zhuangzi. And although there are certain ideas in common with the Tao Te Ching, this commonality is not 100%. While it is hard to decide what the influence of the Tao Te Ching on Zhuangzi may have been, it is much clearer that he was directly influenced by the Mohists, or Mojia, and the logicians, also called the School of Names, or Mingjia. Several anecdotes scattered throughout the book appear of Zhuangzi's encounters with a philosopher named Hui Shi, who was a leading member of this School of Names. Also, language in Book 2, called The Discourse on Making Things Equal, or Qi Wu Lun, is largely a satirical imitation of the arguments of Gong Sun Long, who is another important member of this School of Names philosophical group. Zhuangzi was highly critical of the logician's stance that truth could be determined by making highly technical logical divisions in any given subject matter. The Tao Te Ching was suspicious of language. As you remember from our first lecture on the subject, it was especially suspicious of its ability to describe the Tao. The Zhuangzi is even more comprehensive in its criticism of language. In particular, it criticizes the logician's use of language as helpful to making distinctions, dividing this from that in clear ways. This is related to the Tao Te Ching's notion that binary pairs of adjectives are mutually sustaining. In both cases, there is a suspicion that the categories created by language are too simple to contain the complexities of the world. Let's take a look at one paragraph from that section, The Discourse on Making Things Equal, which, as I just mentioned, is meant as a critique of the School of Names and their reliance on divisions in language. The text says, "Words are not just wind. Words have something to say. But if what they have to say is not fixed, then do they really say something, or do they say nothing? People suppose that words are different from the peeps of baby birds. But is there any difference, or isn't there? What does the way rely upon, that we have true and false? What do words rely upon, that we have right and wrong? How can the way go away and not exist? How can words exist and not be acceptable? When the way relies on little accomplishments and words rely on vain show, then we have the rights and wrongs of the Confucians and the Mohists. What one calls right, the other calls wrong. What one calls wrong, the other calls right. But if we want to right their wrongs and wrong their rights, then the best thing to use is clarity." Notice how this passage is clearly critiquing the use of distinctions in language to try to describe abstract concepts, such as right and wrong, which can't directly and clearly be observed. Let's take a look at another passage, a parable from the chapter Fit for Emperors and Kings. The emperor of the South Sea was called Shu, or brief. The emperor of the North Sea was called Hu, or sudden. And the emperor of the central region was called Huntun, or chaos. Shu and Hu from time to time came together for a meeting in the territory of Huntun, and Huntun treated them very generously. Shu and Hu discussed how they could repay his kindness. All men, they said, have 7 openings so they can see, hear, eat, and breathe. But Huntun alone doesn't have any. Let's try boring him some. Every day they bored another hole, and on the 7th day Huntun died. The meaning of this little parable is that most people think that it's a good thing to have sense perception and to be able to make distinctions and not be confused and chaos riddled in one's thinking. However, when Shu and Hu try to do something nice and give Huntun the ability to make these distinctions and have perception, they end up just killing him. So that, in fact, this kind of perceptual ability is a kind of loss, not a benefit. Now that we've looked at Zhuangzi's philosophy of language, let's think about Zhuangzi and epistemology, which is the branch of philosophy that studies how we know things. Now, if one can't use language to adequately represent the complexity of the world, how does one know what is true? This is a real problem for the Zhuangzi, most famously represented in the allegory of the butterfly dream. In general, the book asserts that there is no good way to know truth from statements that can be expressed in logically verifiable ways. Instead of knowing truth as an intellectual proposition, one can experience a kind of authentic being by being natural and spontaneous, floating along with the world in whatever way it takes you. Let's look at that allegory of the butterfly dream. This is probably the most famous paragraph in the whole book, and it comes from the very end of the chapter Discourse on Making Things Equal. Once, Zhuangzi dreamt he was a butterfly flitting and fluttering around, happy with himself and doing as he pleased. He didn't know he was Zhuangzi. Suddenly, he woke up, and there he was, solid and unmistakable Zhuangzi. But he didn't know if he was Zhuangzi who had dreamt he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that he was Zhuangzi. Between Zhuangzi and a butterfly, there must be some distinction. This is called the transformation of things. This parable is giving us a very familiar lesson. How does one know that one isn't actually dreaming one's life? Notice, however, that it gives us something a little bit extra. Between Zhuangzi and a butterfly, there must be some distinction. Because those are different words, Zhuangzi and butterfly. But is that a real distinction? Or is it a false one created by language? Somehow, the problems of epistemology, how we know what is really true, are related to the process of distinction which language imposes on the world. Let's look at another parable from the chapter Knowledge Wandered North. Knowledge wandered north to the banks of the black waters, climbed the knoll of hidden heights, and there by chance came upon Do Nothing, Say Nothing. Knowledge said to Do Nothing, Say Nothing, "There are some things I'd like to ask you. What sort of pondering, what sort of cogitation does it take to know the way? What sort of surroundings, what sort of practices does it take to find rest in the way? What sort of path, what sort of procedure will get me to the way?" 3 questions he asked, but Do Nothing, Say Nothing didn't answer. It wasn't just that he didn't answer, he didn't know how to answer. This text is holding up do nothing, say nothing as an ideal sage. His non-answer, and in fact his not knowing how to answer, is in fact the best answer to knowledge's questions. The best way to know the way, to find rest in the way, and to get to the way, is to not understand, to not know how to describe things. One more parable. This is from the chapter Autumn Floods. It describes an encounter of Zhuangzi with Hui Shi, who, you will remember from earlier in the lecture, was one of the important members of the logicians, or the school of names, the philosophy to which Zhuangzi was most directly opposed. Zhuangzi and Huizi were strolling along the dam of the Hao River, when Zhuangzi said, "See how the minnows come out and dart around where they please. That's what fish really enjoy." Huizi said, "You're not a fish. How do you know what fish enjoy?" Zhuangzi said, "You're not I, so how do you know I don't know what fish enjoy?" Huizi said, "I'm not you, so I certainly don't know what you know. On the other hand, you're certainly not a fish. So that still proves you don't know what fish enjoy." Zhuangzi said, "Let's go back to your original question, please. You asked me how I know what fish enjoy. So you already knew I knew it when you asked the question. I know it by standing here beside the how." Now, this little anecdote shows Zhuangzi being very clever in playing on words. Huizi has a point by the normal rules of logic. He may not know what Zhuangzi knows or doesn't know, but as long as we grant that Zhuangzi is a person and not a fish, then it follows naturally that he doesn't know what fish know. Zhuangzi's point is that this sort of logic is irrelevant. He can know what fish know simply by physical proximity. If you have ever played with an animal or watched an animal play around in nature, you might be able to get a similar feeling. It's perhaps logically impossible to put yourself in the role of the animal to know what it feels like to be that animal, but sometimes when we're watching animals, it simply seems obvious that they are enjoying themselves or frightened or hungry or whatever. Zhuangzi's idea is that sometimes being enmeshed in nature, responding instinctually to nature, is a sufficient path to knowledge. In such cases, one doesn't need logic, and logic can be misleading. Finally, let's think for a bit about Zhuangzi and literary form. The book, the Zhuangzi, was not influential just in the realm of philosophy. It was also highly influential on the course of Chinese literature, art, and aesthetics. But there's a basic problem here. The suspicion of language as a means to truth is a weird position for a book to take. If you don't believe language can communicate truth, why would you write a book? Moreover, the Zhuangzi is well written. It has some of the most unusual and impressive literary style of any work written in the earliest period of Chinese literature. So how do we resolve this contradiction, that the book is using beautiful written language to downplay the importance of language? The Zhuangzi's style is generally playful, and deliberately silly, as if calling attention to the fact that this is not meant to convey truth in any straightforward fashion. And it's in part the unusual playful style that helps make this text a favorite for later writers. The Zhuangzi is often thought of in Chinese society as being most notable for the first source of allegories in China, or the word that we use is 寓言. By this is meant stories told to illustrate a philosophical point. And the word 寓言 is actually the title of one of the books of the Zhuangzi, and is explained as typical of the writing of the work, which is why the notion of allegory and the modern word 寓言 is associated with the stories told in the text. However, this word 寓言, which in modern Chinese certainly does mean allegory, in the Zhuangzi actually means something more like speech attributed to someone else. The idea is that the text's stories need to be attributed to historical or fictional figures in order to secure readers' approval. Here is the original description from the 寓言, or imputed words chapter. The imputed words, which make up 9/10 of it, are like persons brought in from outside for the purpose of exposition. A father does not act as a go-between for his own son, because the praises of the father would not be as effective as the praises of an outsider. It is the fault of other men, not mine, that I must resort to such a device, for if I were to speak in my own words, then men would respond only to what agrees with their own views and reject what does not, would pronounce right what agrees with their own views, and wrong what does not. In other words, these imputed words are a rhetorical technique. Zhuangzi is falsely attributing stories to historical or fictional personages. You may have remembered certain stories involving Confucius appearing in this book. This is not the real Confucius, and these stories do not have Confucius advocating what the real Confucius would have advocated. Instead, Zhuangzi is putting his own idea in the mouth of Confucius and of other historical figures in order to persuade an audience. Let's summarize what we've talked about today. The Zhuangzi is a book attributed to Zhuangzhou. It is not well known in the West, but is equally influential as the Tao Te Ching on the history of Taoism in the later civilization of China. The Zhuangzi shares some ideas in common with the Tao Te Ching, but these two books should not be assumed to be in total agreement. Zhuangzhou was clearly reacting against the logical system of the logicians. The Zhuangzi is skeptical of language's function of creating distinctions, since it is not capable of representing the world adequately. This suggests that one should not try to argue about philosophical truths, but experience the way in direct contact with the natural world.